So it's a pleasure for me to be here, and I'm very happy to, let's say, to open this first session. As there are many people or several people that have never heard about this strange theme about the financialization of urban production, we wanted to present to you the issue, okay? But we did not want to make, let's say, a series of presentation, okay? So we have chosen to present you the kind of network of people we are. We are economic geographers, which means that we like to see how different things are across space, even if we have common understanding. Better? Yes. Okay. So we will have here 5 people representing, let's say, 5 countries. So the idea is really to understand and to present to you the diversity of the situations. We have Beatrice from Brazil, Felix from France, Ivana from Argentina, Phil from the US, and I come from Switzerland. And of course, we will present to you short inputs, okay? We have 3 rounds of these inputs. The first one is about the organization and the institutions of real estate markets and of the financial sector in our countries, okay? The second one will be about the contribution of this sector, real estate, construction and infrastructures, to the transition. Because of course, in all our countries, this sector is a very central one regarding transitions, okay? And the third round will be about the challenges that we are facing in all these countries, okay? And then after, we will have normally 1 hour in order to have a common discussion with you. So first, I give the word to Beatrice, who will speak about the Brazilian situation.
So, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Regarding the first topic, I discussed the institutional change that shape the financialization of real estate production in Brazil. I will call the attention to a paradox. Deep institutional transformations are structured and approved in the context of austerity and crisis, but gain prominence and are more disseminated during periods of economic growth and expansion in an economy with a history of vulnerabilities and recurring crises. Associated with the neoliberal adjustments of the 90s, economic austerity policies paved the way for significant institutional change in the real estate sectors in Brazil, aiming to expand the role of private sector. In this context, inflation control associated with the establishment of the highest interest rates worldwide, around 40% a year, laid the foundations for Brazil's insertion as an international platform for financial appreciation, as stated by Leda Paulani, through its public debts. In this decade, rates and other financial real estate securities were also regulated, and also the real estate finance system was created in 1997 in an attempt to link real estate production and its finance to the capital market. The SFI, the real estate finance system, was intended to expand the real estate markets, working together with the historical housing finance system, which had structured the expansion of house finance in Brazil since the 60s. This public system was based on parastatal source from workers, compulsory reserves, and safe. The SFI, the new one, also regulated the fundamental reforms in property rights, provide more legal security to creditors. The financialization and more effective mobilizations of this new institutional device advanced in the real economy with the economic growth that began around 2003. Associated with the commodity boom, which among other movements paved significant growth in the national capital market, especially between 2004 and 2007. As Lavina develops, Unlike central countries where financialization advanced in recessive contexts, in Brazil, the deepening of financialization dynamic occurred during a phase of real wage increase, mitigation of income disparities, and implementation of redistributive policies. The real estate sector going preeminence in this movement, with IPO of major real estate developers, structured the sector in new bases. The economic power of this company and the great threat of 2008 crisis positioned the real estate sector as one of the great beneficiaries of counter-cyclical policies, with the institutions of My Home, My Life program that since 2009, these programs, mainly based on finance and subsidies for private company, has financed around 7 million units across Brazil, expanding the real estate market reach to low-income populations. Brazil rates also saw a huge in expansion and diversification from 2008 onwards, associated with other forms of financial security and vision since the 90s. The 2014 crisis brought profound regressive reforms, as mentioned by our colleagues, especially for workers and social investments. These reforms were strongly supported by real estate sector, contradictory. Once and again, the reforms are appropriating a new, more financialized and contradictory expansion cycle, based on more sophisticated and concentrated real estate productions in wealth areas with increased proeminence of financial instruments and institutional investors. In this late, and to conclude, in this late 25 years of intense house provision, even though there is a small increase in rented households, the country's ownership structure remains at historical average at 65% of private homes, reflecting the persistent combinations of market production with self-construction. That I would say that is a striking specificity of our country. Thank you.
Bom dia. Good morning, everybody. So in order to address the topic of real estate markets and finance in France, my country, we must go back to the 80s, actually, a decade during which financial investors, with banks and insurance companies as main players, significantly increased their positions in real estate, primarily focusing on commercial properties, offices. This led to the creation of a bubble during the 80s, which burst in 1991. As analyzed by Antoine and Ludovic in their last book, Antoine and Ludovic are present here, foreign investors, mainly subsidiaries of North American investment banks, said the opportunity of this crisis to acquire distressed assets, which they quickly sold off when the commercial property market bounced back. But the entry of these companies also introduced a new culture into the professional milieu of real estate, that of active asset management. This trend aligns with the significant shift toward asset manager capitalism, a topic we will discuss in detail this afternoon during the plenary session, right? So private banks, French private banks such as Amundi or BNP Paribas Real Estate Investment Management, as well as insurance companies, established subsidiaries tasked with creating and managing real estate funds. This dynamic was accompanied by the rapid growth of listed property companies, as well as global developers diversifying their business into this segment. Bia spoke about the 2008 crisis, but in France, in hindsight, this crisis can be viewed as a temporary setback rather than a game changer in this trend. Indeed, the portfolio of asset manager continued to grow in both size and value, adding 25 billion euros per year of investment in the last two last decades. They now manage assets at the pinnacle of real estate and urban hierarchies, solidifying finance grip on the built environment. Yet this grip has been limited by two main factors in France. Firstly, retirement schemes in France have a very limited impact compared to other OECD countries and Brazil, actually, with pension fund systems. This is due to France's maintenance of a pay-as-you-go system, thanks to workers' movements during the 90s and recently during the 2010s. And so pension funds are only complementary and therefore primarily for highly paid jobs. The second factor is that until now, housing has been only marginally considered a viable asset by financial investors and asset managers who perceive housing in France as too complex to manage and regulated by legislation too favorable to tenants. On the other hand, there is strong opposition from companies and institutions in the social housing sector to the infiltration of finance into the industry. They defend the specific financial circuit of French social housing, which combines households, private regulated savings, and public support. Lastly, it is important to have in mind that home loans in France are not securitized, which is an institutional feature limiting the financialization of housing in the country through collaterals. As a consequence, since the 80s, commercial properties have been the favored asset class of financial investors. Commercial properties being offices, right? Additionally, malls and logistics properties are now dominated by this industry, alongside the entry in niche markets such as infrastructure finance, retirement homes, and private hospitals.
Well, I also want to thank the organizers for being here. I'm going to make a few key points and facts about the financial system in Argentina that is somehow similar to the Brazilian one, so I won't repeat things that Bia mentioned. But I would say that the first thing that characterizes our financial system is that our economy works de facto as a bimonetary economy, with pesos and dollars being converted every day, in an extremely high inflation system. In the past 7 years, inflation has been around 5,000%. So also, our system is characterized by high volatility, which has led to several crises in the past 10 years. So I would say that real estate investment cycles and real estate financialization are therefore strongly influenced by microeconomic issues and by macroeconomic cycles. On the other hand, they are also very much influenced by ideological or political issues, in the sense that in the past 10 years we've had 4 governments, 2 that were perceived by the international market as being anti-business, and the other ones being perceived as being pro-business. So what, of course, this is not exclusively of the pro-business moments, but what we see in these pro-business governments is that they have implied a very deep financial reforms, facilitation, indebtedness, privatization, and attracting international and foreign investments into real estate and infrastructures. But these cycles last around 2 or 3 years in Argentina, so we see changes in cycles very frequently. On the other hand, these pro-market moments are times of euphoria for investments. So, for example, since December, with these last governments, this infamous last governments, we've seen over 40% of decline in the construction and activity in only 5 months. However, developers are hoarding lands with the expectation of price increase and new support from the government. So these moments of perceived pro-business moments are times of emphatic optimism from the business community, which is that regard this moment as a moment of normalization of the economy. So the way I interpret this is that if we analyze the long-term history of housing financialization and financialization of real estate, we see, or I see it as financialization experiments. Cycles lasting 2-3 years where the government tries to connect investment with space production through financialized schemes and financialized instruments, using or trying to connect the formal financial institutions, the capital market investment banks, REITs, etc., as opposed to other more informal financial schemes involving more or less unregulated channels and transactions made in cash, cryptocurrencies, and channeled outside the countries through the formal financial system. So this another key element of our system is that capital flight, although it's very structural in all of Latin America, in Argentina is specifically high and important to understand real estate sector, because capital flight means that, for example, in the housing sector, transactions are made with hoarded dollar bills that people have under the mattress. So this is in a way a limit to the financialization run by very formal very formal channels and financialized schemes. So when looking at the investors, what we see is that, like the French system, we have a public pension fund, so that it's that is not so much that is not key or so much key to understand housing financialization, although it plays a role. But institutional investors and banks only have participated, of course, in real estate financialization, but for very brief periods of times when they find opportunities of extreme profits due to state support. So, so when we analyze the financial instruments in place, there are, of course, mortgage-based securities and REITs, etc. But as I said, I see them as working only in times of opportunity and with extreme support from public funding to make this a profitable businesses for the institutional investors. So to sum up, international financial capital doesn't find opportunities in the housing sector or in other commercial or in the commercial sector, besides brief moments, as I said, but they do find opportunities to financialize other sectors of the economy that are very much financialized. In the case of, for example, infrastructure, the international financial capital penetrates through the acquisition of business groups' participation and stock participation in the large business groups and conglomerates of the country. They also participate strongly in the consumption credit also through their role in the business groups and their participation in other institutions organizing consumption credit, and also, of course, in other more extractive activities such as agribusiness, farmland, food industry, and mining. So the focus is not so much housing, for sure, and less in the shopping and office subsegments of the real estate sector.
Nice to see you all. I'm going to talk about the American context. And in order to really talk about real estate investments in the United States, we really have to talk about the process of financial modernization, is a term that's often used and sort of the transformations in the nature of financial intermediation. And this takes us actually, I think, much earlier than the Brazilian or the French or the Argentinian context. It takes us back to the crises of the post-war period, the crises of Fordism, particularly the 1960s and 1970s, the difficulties in the banking sector, and the primary dynamics that I associate with this dynamic of financial modernization as a regulatory project, as an attempt by policymakers and financial regulators to solve the problems of the inability to form capital to invest in critical investments. The primary dynamics have been centralization and consolidation. Now, centralization in the 1960s, and 1970s was an attempt by financial regulators and policymakers to turn to capital markets as direct sources of funds for investments, whether in housing, in commercial real estate, or in infrastructure. The banking sector was in deep crisis. The inability of banks really to generate the capital to invest in housing was seen as a major crisis in the 1960s, late 1960s. It led to the formation of a whole new set of institutions, what we refer to as the government-sponsored enterprises, which were direct ways of connecting investments in housing to capital markets and to institutional investors. And that turned to capital markets. Centralizing the generation of capital in capital markets themselves was really a central dynamics. It has a much deeper roots, and we can trace it back to the euro-dollar markets of the 1960s if you want to go that far down. But it was first expressed in the turn to securitization as a way of funding home mortgages, as a way of solving the crisis of housing finance in the late 1960s and 1970s. By the 1980s, this had morphed into commercial real estate, very slow sort of migration into other sectors. But the relative success of this approach of being able to tap directly into institutional investment funds as a way of forming capital meant that it was progressively applied to other domains of finance. So as I mentioned, commercial real estate through the 1980s and 1990s was brought into this mode of financing. Infrastructure as well. I think we can see a progressive integration of infrastructure into this mode of financing. And that means that essentially Wall Street is at the center of the process of capital formation, with all of the issues around sort of volatility, risk-taking, speculation that we associate with that. The other side, the other dynamic alongside that, the dynamic of consolidation, right? A secondary regulatory response to the crises of post-war finance was giving financial intermediaries the powers necessary to be able to weather financial volatility, right? Essentially removing restrictions on their ability to issue credit, facilitating their expansion into new business lines or new geographic areas, as well as essentially unlocking their balance sheets by allowing them to swap their long-term assets, right? Home mortgages, for instance, 30-year home mortgages, allowing them to sell those to institutional investors on capital markets, giving them new capital to allow them to essentially invest in new assets. This provided pathways for banks and financial intermediaries to grow their way out of the financial turbulence of the late 1970s and 80s. But in the process, it also unleashed new dynamics of competition. So we got more growth through mergers, right? Banks that get larger and larger, essentially by taking over their competitors. And we get multiple moments of creative destruction, culminating in the bank merger wave of the 1990s, which has since 1999 has really involved a series of moments of consolidation, which has led us, I think, to not only the large investment banks that dominate the American scene, but also the international scene, the Citibanks, the JP Morgan Chases, but also increasingly these asset management funds, sort of the Black Rocks, the Blackstones that play such a critical role. I'll stop there.
Sorry, I prefer to stand up when I'm speaking to people like that. So, very different cases, as you can see, and I add one more special cases, which is Switzerland. And in Switzerland, well, just to compare a little bit with Brazil, for instance, two-thirds of the people are rent their flats, okay? So we have a very high proportion of renting people, okay? And 15 years ago, it was already more than that. 3/4 of the households were renting their apartments, okay? This is the first point. The second point is that prices in Switzerland are very, very high. I mean, they are comparable to the largest European cities, I mean, like Paris and London. And this is true not only in big cities, but also in second-tier cities. Okay, so on the entire territory, you have very high prices. So you would tell me, but how do people do in order to buy a house in such a context? And the answer is straightforward, is that nobody pays those prices. Nobody pays these prices because nobody reimburses the mortgages, okay? Banks are much more interested in keeping people indebted and in getting the income of interest rates rather than to get the money back, let's say, okay? And today the interest rates for mortgages are very low, something like between 1% and 2%. Inflation is more or less at 2%. And the interesting point is that anthropologically, Swiss people trust very much their currency. So in most countries, like Brazil or others, when people try to make savings, in fact, they try to build a house or to construct a house, okay? And to have a house. In Switzerland, no, people prefer to keep money because it brings money. For example, treasury bonds today are between 3 and 3.5%. So you've better to keep indebted with the mortgage and to buy treasury bonds with that money, okay? So the financial stability and the monetary stability is the core of all this system. I'm used to say to my students that take a 10-cent coin, Swiss 10-cent coin, which was created in 1850. 1850. It is still valid today. So it's 10 cents are still something today in Switzerland. So it's a very, very, very stable system. No wars, no financial crisis, no monetary crisis, and people trust money. Okay, and this is very important to understand. Regarding now the rental market, we have very powerful pension funds. Very powerful. The contribution to pension funds is compulsory for all the people who get a wage, okay? So which means that pension funds have a lot of money to invest, and they invest part of it, approximately between 15 and 20% of these funds are invested in Swiss real estate, okay? We also have insurance companies, and the interesting point, of course, is that these pension funds are very powerful, and they have, let's say, some kind of standard of centralized management of real estate and of flats. Okay. So I would say that that's it for the first round. So shall we perhaps open 5-minute or 10-minute discussion now? Oh yes.
Do we have any question for this first round? No. Yes, you do. We have two.
Thank you very much. Super interesting presentations. I'm wondering how migration is affecting the housing markets and maybe also the credit markets. In Eastern Europe, where I come from, this is a big issue. But but not this kind of labor migration, but also migration from rich entrepreneurs from other geographies. Thank you.
Hi everyone. We had a discussion about pension funds and other institutional investors, and I noted that every one of you made in a speech about, touched in this point during your speech. I was wondering if you could make a small comment about what you heard and a comparison between the countries. So what it means to have institutional investors in each country, what are their roles and how powerful they are, and especially what are the institutional investors that hold commercial real estate or infrastructures that I know some of you study. Thank you very much.
I will start from the pension funds. I would say that we have a particular situations in terms of housing financialization in Brazil that is much more related with the production process, not the consumption. So we don't have a mortgage market very well developed, but on the other hand, the IPOs of the company were historically very important. So we don't have this important role of pension funds in the housing market, although, as Maíra knows very well and had been researched a lot, they have a very important role in the commercial sectors, and more recently it's also in infrastructure. The migration, I think, is a more difficult issue for the Brazilian case. I think the numbers are not so high as Eastern Europe, but I would say that they are more or less excluded in our system. And when we bring this theme, in case like São Paulo, they are more related to struggles to occupy buildings in the center of the city, to have access to the city through some social and urban movements, than formally access housing, finance, and things like that. But there is some research going on regarding the role of these immigrants in the local dynamics and struggles related to building occupations, mainly in the central areas.
I propose perhaps to switch to the second round.
Yes.
Please look at this.
And the other ones, maybe we can do the whole discussion one, isn't it?
Do you want to do that? Do you want to?
Because the
Yeah.
questions were-
I propose to move to the second round, and then we will open the general discussion for all themes, okay?
So, yes. As many you know, transitions is not exactly my theme of research, so I prepare some fake based in some quick research I did. So what I want to know about transition and this relation for real estate dynamics is that, first, in 2019, 70% of carbon emissions in Brazil are related to land use change and agriculture, closely connected to deforestation process and the growing significance of agribusiness in the country's economy. Because of that, we can say in a first glance that even we have a counter-urbanizations around 85%, that is really high, urban sphere is not in the center of the energy transition. Still, energy consumption pose a general challenge for the country, with a significant increase in emissions in the last 10 years related to transport metrics that is heavily reliant on fossil fuels. In this context, the major challenge for the urban agglomerates is to expand the implementations and use of high-quality public transportations. The long commute distance in these cities are a result of a rapid and uneven urbanization, which has led to densely populated and poorly equipped peripheries. This real problem has been heavily mobilized by transportation and real estate sectors, increasingly organized as economic groups with growing ties to finance. The sectors and the groups have strongly embraced the environmental agenda, adopting ESG policies and seek green certifications in many kinds. The adoption of the green principles is also increasingly a requirement for access finance, particularly from the major global players that looking for emerging country as a way to reduce their emissions. So in terms of public policy, this diagnosis of unsustainable urbanization has anchored some expansion of investment in transportation, is still limited, but with the generalization of public-private partnership that I will talk a bit later in the third phase, and also accelerated the implementation of some urban renewal policies, discussed furtherly supported by the principles of transit-oriented development. The urban renewal mobility policies have become particularly evident in São Paulo after the approval of the new master plan in 2014. This metropolis, which concentrates more than 30% of the country's real estate productions, has shown a substantial increase in constructions over the past 5 years, with a significant densifications along mobility corridors, located in its most dynamic areas. Although this corridor areas correspond around 3% of the municipality area, in 2019, they accounted for 42 of the building area. While the matter of while the master plan puts this strategy as a way of increased house affordability, what emerged in this process is a robust real estate inflation that ended up redefining ownership structures of this space, leading to a significant property concentration in the form of real estate funds and property companies, with the developments produced for short and medium-term rentals for higher income segments. Generally, this type of policy has effectively led to an increase in house prices, further entrenching the poor populations in precarious areas. As we see in Porto Alegre, the poorest repeatedly emerge as the primary victims of environment tragedy in our country.
Okay. In my response to this second question, I will focus on the relationship between ecological transition and the financialization of the built environment. Today in France, public policies aimed at supporting the energy transition are addressing both consumption and production aspects. On the consumption side, while the 90s and the 2000s was characterized by legislative changes targeting energy consumption in new buildings, efforts are directed towards energy savings in existing buildings, right? Particularly in heating system and insulation. Meanwhile, on the production side, policies are supporting decarbonization, especially through investments in nuclear power plants, which is a specificity, a French specificity, right? Finance capital is targeted for implementing these policies on both sides, consumption and production. I will not address that of energy production, for which several investment funds have been created during the last decade. On the consumption side, energy retrofits concentrate the attention of policymakers. For example, after a decade of procrastination, the central government has eventually passed a decree in 2019 that sets energy consumption reduction goals to non-residential buildings. Phil has started a work about these policies of retrofit and in new words, more specifically on public-private partnership for investments in grid building technologies, understanding how the prioritization of public facilities as strategic sites for local climate action has translated into a positioning public buildings retrofits as opportunities for private financial investment, and this in Paris, right? Yet the relationship between finance and what policymakers call ecological transition is not limited to energy production and building retrofits. The promise of climate finance or green finance landed in France and is actively constructed by actors and institutions of global finance and the national and local governments, with the city of Paris being particularly active in this domain. I would not like to unveil Antoine's research project on this issue, but green bonds and municipal investment funds have been designed and issued in order to finance different infrastructure projects such as the Grand Paris Express, which is a metro around Paris. As a result, France is now the third issuer of green bonds in the world. And as Antoine said, this ways to frame the transition implies aligning the fight against climate change with the time horizon and risk returns metrics of financial markets, whose investments and workings are arguably one of the causes of climate change. In both cases, energy retrofit through PPP and impact investment infrastructures, the search for financial capital by public authorities is also motivated by austerity measures and the local and national levels that is austerity measures at the local and national levels that impede to engage this work through public investments only. So even if I can't develop these points, there is just a conceptual link between consolidation policies or austerity and the way in which the financing of the energy transition through capital market is contemplated.
Well, thank you very much. This is not at all my field of expertise, but I'll try to wrap up a few key points again. So one of the things that is important to understand about Argentina, and the case is very similar to Brazil, but has more contradictions within it. So the first thing is Argentina's emission rank above the global average when measured in relation to GDP and population. But the energy sector and the agricultural sector account for 90% of the emissions. So for Argentina, this creates a very an important contradiction, which is that the highest emissions come from the two sectors that are supposed to provide foreign exchange and highly needed foreign exchange in the form of dollars. Therefore, transitioning or changing the models of these of the fossil fuel sector and of the agricultural sector is very challenging, because on the one hand, the agricultural sector is very much vulnerable to the climate change, but on the other hand, the possibilities of changing that means attacking the source of foreign exchange. So while Argentina subscribes to the Paris Agreement and is increasingly ambitious promises So while Argentina subscribes to the Paris Agreement with increasingly ambitious profile of promises, it faces considerable challenge in light of the US and EU threats to tariff emissions or to impose commercial barriers. So to tackle climate change, the need, of course, or the government has diagnosed the need of a large sum of investment, but it's not really interested in producing these transformations because it needs the agreement and attacking two of the main sectors. But regarding investments and international investment, it's important to understand that Latin America barely captures 5% of the total climate finance available in the world. So, and this green bonds market is mainly denominated in hard currencies, which is a known risk factor for emerging economies, and because it creates, of course, a currency mismatch problem. And the solution so far has been to trust on national development banks and public source to fund this transition. But also the public sectors are, of course, going through several macroeconomic and political issues these days. But another thing is that the effects of natural disasters and climate change will highly affect the sovereignty risk premia for emerging economies. So indebting in international markets with hard currency is one of the main challenges. So in that scenario, the government has launched contradictory policies. because on the one hand, providing cheap energy after COVID, it's a very political issue and it's a very important political agenda for the government. So it has focused on high carbon activities by the form of direct subsidies to the oil and gas sector, as well as monetary transfer to households and companies. So on the one hand is promoting high carbon activities, but on the other hand has made some efforts to provide transition in the form of renewable energy and supporting wind energy, and also transportation adaptation and forestation. And the central bank has created a guidance lines to assess financial risk associated to climate change in order to sort of tackle climate transition. But so far, these green bonds are very limited by are structured by are structured by American companies, and they are all denominated in US dollars and mainly bought by multinational financial institutions. Most were issued during these neoliberal pro-market governments that I mentioned before, and mostly oriented to renewable energy production projects. And in the case of renewable energy production, we see once again sort of financialization experiments in these sectors, while the government, as I said, is supporting other high carbon activities.
So unlike the examples of, say, France or Argentina, the US has a fairly weak policy framework for financing the green transition. The dynamics of centralization and consolidation that I talked about earlier, US policymakers essentially have sort of left it to financial markets to be able to figure out, to sniff out the possibilities for profit and thereby sort of channel capital towards a green transition. And to some extent that has worked. We can certainly see the emergence of new circuits of finance, and that's one of the sort of underlying dynamics of centralization, is that even as Wall Street plays a much more significant role in determining who gets capital, if you can tap into capital markets, then the possibility of sort of streaming off some capital for investments in niche circuits becomes a possibility, right? So even though we have large actors, the JP Morgan Chases, the BlackRocks at the center of that ecosystem, there are niche circuits that arise, and certainly there's a niche circuit that we can identify within, say, commercial real estate, investment funds that focus on financing green transitions or financing sort of green building technologies. We can point to the emergence of specific niche innovative financial instruments that try to capitalize those investments. We can focus on the commitments made by a number of institutional investors towards environmental and social goals. And we can even look at sort of new forms of certification that have emerged, right? Trying to essentially certify green investments so that markets see them as legible and act on them. Many of those, though, because of their links into capital markets, are we okay? No, okay, yeah, right. Because of their links into capital markets, many of those are given coherence by the larger frameworks of US financial policy and particularly central bank regulation. And most of that over the last 15 years has been driven by a zero interest rate policy, right? Essentially the turn to driving down the cost of borrowing to try and solve the problems of persistent financial crises, 2007, 2008 being the first, the weak growth through the 2010s being the second, and then COVID being a third. And that has made a whole bunch of investments seem more palatable than they may actually be. And I think that that's certainly a dynamic now as we're moving out of the zero interest rate policy era. It's become clear that financial capital turned to those niche circuits primarily because they saw opportunities to capture a green rent, right? And that green rent was only really possible to the extent that the costs of borrowing were driven down next to nothing, and the dynamics of leverage, and we can talk a little bit more about leverage if we want to, the dynamics of leverage of transforming small equity investments into super profits, those were made possible by very low interest rates. And as we move away from that, it's not entirely clear that that green rent is going to sustain itself, and whether that circuit is going to be present to the extent necessary to finance the green transition. The other dynamic that I think is very present is, particularly with the environmental and social goals, is the degree to which finance capital is choosing things it would have financed anyways, right? Essentially a process of creaming, sort of picking out the sexiest looking investments, the things that generate the highest impacts or good public relations opportunities. It's not clear whether the dynamics of capital mobilization are going to be there sufficient in the US context to be able to finance green transition to the level necessary. And I think that points to a deeper geopolitics of the green transition, where Americans are sort of holding their military capabilities to generate resources out of transition rather than their financial capabilities.
Thank you. So just 2 words about the case of Switzerland. Well, Switzerland has a very high carbon print, okay, per inhabitant. And the idea is that the construction sector and the real estate sector should contribute very much to the improvement of the situation. And there, of course, the first thing is about insulation, because in Switzerland, okay, heating costs a lot, and the question of insulation is very important. And happily, regarding insulation, the institutions are quite supportive, in the sense that as they are rather centralized, as we have many pension funds and many people who are renting the houses, the housing management companies have to deal with that question. And they do it, I would say, at once in one time for one building. Okay, we can make insulation outside of the building, which is not the case, for example, in France, where many people own their own apartment, and where collective property is not that strong, and people have to make insulation individually. And this is quite a big difference in terms of the development of energy saving. Of course, houses are also supposed to be energetically positive, so there are plenty of incentives regarding that. And here, clearly, pension funds or other institutional investors see also that as an opportunity to create more value, okay? To create more value either by selling energy or by diminishing some costs, but also sometimes by increasing rents, which of course can be a problem also for part of the population. So the second big issue during the last 10 years was to stop urban sprawls. Well, okay, if in Brazil, as Bia said, the urbanization went through corridors, in Switzerland during the 90s and 2000s, there was the neoliberal idea that each municipality should attract, and I come to one element that has been mentioned before, had to attract people, and of course to attract rich taxpayers, okay? So, and the result of this is that many of these municipalities opened zones for the construction of houses or blocks, and the result was a scattered kind of urbanization, which was really seen as a disaster by the population, because the population is very much attached to the landscape, okay, as an asset for the country. And this had disastrous consequences for the landscape, and the result of that was that 3 federal laws were voted and also contested on referendum, but finally enforced, in order to prevent those sprawls, okay? Which the consequence of this is that today the land that can be urbanized is of course very restricted, which asks other types of questions. Okay, maybe we have time for 2-3 questions, and before shifting to the or not.
Anyone? Mateus. If you don't mind, okay.
Stand up. I wasn't prepared to stand up. Just a minute. Well, I do have a question. I do have a question for you all, if you don't mind. It's a quick question. I wasn't really prepared to stand up. But I've written it here, and I would read, if you don't mind. Well, when we talk about transition towards sustainability related to the real estate market, it seems to me that such market is occupied only with a neoliberal sense of sustainability and sustainable development, which doesn't tackle at all the insustainability of capitalism itself, but actually, as stated by Professor Ashton, create a niche for some fractions of capital to make profit, such as LEED and ISO 14001 certifications. The question is, how would you classify the general approach of urban economic geographers and researchers alike in your countries towards that issue? Are they really critical, or are they supportive of these kinds of greenwashing initiatives? Thank you.
So my question would be about the impact of energy price crisis on the housing regime in your countries. I'm coming from Romania, and there it seems that experts foreseen that the cost of living crisis, which was triggered by the energy price crisis and the high inflation rates, will change the tenant structure in the country. So I'm wondering if this is the case for you too.
Want me to start? Yeah, want me to start? Thank you for your question on neoliberal sustainability. I think American scholars, North American scholars, are within economic geography are highly critical of the green turn, understand the degrees to which it is potentially either a ruse or sort of a new form of capture. I think the question really is the degree, the qualities of capture and the qualities of the ruse, right? Is it simply a form of kind of the next iteration of political capture by capital over the state, right? In using different terminologies than the former terminologies of, say, the imperative to economic development, right? The imperative to green suddenly becomes a way in which green capital sort of exerts its control, right? That might be one interpretation. For me, I think I'm personally trying to develop an understanding of neoliberal sustainability from the inside, right? Trying to follow finance into the way in which financial logics exert their own kind of power, independent of whether political actors are there exerting control or not, right? So what does a green bond actually do? What does an energy retrofit loan? What does an energy service company do when you apply discounting logics or risk frameworks to green transition? What does that do from the inside to the challenges of transition itself? And it turns out it does a lot. And I think the questions that we're trying to grapple with as North American economic geographers is there a pathway beyond that? Energy crisis, maybe I'll let somebody else answer the energy crisis. I mean, other than to say that I am serious that I believe that Americans believe they can buy their way out of the energy crisis, right? So there is no energy crisis in the United States. There's no politics of an energy crisis. There's certainly no experience of an energy crisis, and that's going to be the same with water. I think I really fundamentally believe that a key dimension of the populist movements of the United States are a belief that if climate change becomes real, that they'll be able to either buy their way out or fight their way out. And I'm trying not to be too glib with that, but I do believe that's a strong undercurrent of American populism right now.
Yeah, just to respond on the energy crisis. In France, it has been linked to the war in Ukraine, and so what is interesting is that it reframed the way in which we envision the energy transition. I mean, in the last year it has been less linked to ecological question and more to the war and the foreign policy and the independence in front of Russia. So it became, yes, another frame of this issue of energy consumption. it has been an impact, an immediate impact. I mean, the consumption for eating lowered in France a lot during the last winter. So it's more, it had an impact on the behavior rather than on works on the buildings, except for public buildings. It has been a large plan which was also linked to the post-COVID crisis, and it was an economic plan to the relaunch of the economy. But yes, the central state invested a lot in energy savings in public building, for instance, schools, courts, and so on. And this was motivated not only for the relaunch of the economy, but also in order to get more independence in relation to energy consumption. Yes, in this context.
On the energy crisis, Argentina is such a large country, and it's an energy producer and an energy exporter. So in the times of the crisis, Argentina actually didn't felt that crisis because it was producing and probably had the benefit of exporting at higher prices. Therefore, it was a source of income for the country. And also in the case of household energy prices, it's extremely subsidized. Therefore, because it's a very politicized issue, and the last government actually lost elections because of the high increasement in prices, this extremely neoliberal government is actually controlling prices and not allowing the companies to increase prices in the households, but at the same time is strongly subsidizing the companies and allowing them to export most of their production. So this is like we are in times where in a few months there will be probably a shortage of electricity at the household level because of the allowing these companies to export at very high prices. So I would say it's a different situation to the small countries that are not producers.
So regarding the agenda and the challenge, I tried to organize this last stage in 3 themes, trying to put some important points in terms of business agenda, public policy agenda, and also academic agenda. And also we can discuss later the questions of Mateus. So regarding the business agendas, I would like to highlight 2 recent movements that I consider particularly relevant to urban dynamics and its relations with financialization. The first dynamic, which we'll be discussing in the other sessions, is the financializations of rental policies. Although it is a nascent movement here in Brazil, its importance lies in attracting large international investors. According to these investors, the potential of rental market in the country has expanded due to the substantial increase in real estate prices and finance interest rates, which have made home ownerships unattainable for large part of the poorer population and have established attractive returns in high-income sector developments. So large international pension funds and powerful asset managers have intensively partnered with some major national developers to produce rental house recently. One emblematic case is the partnership, for example, is the partnership between Brookfield and MRV, that is the biggest, largest Brazilian developer, to construct around 5,000 rental house units. the idea of hunting is also becoming more prevalent in public policy, and it's strongly associated with the increasing disseminations of PPP, which we understand as the second relevant business agenda. So in Brazil, between 2004 and 2020, we had 402 infrastructure and urban service concessions and PPP contracts, totaling over around $60 billion. So during the period of economic growth that I mentioned before, public-private partnerships were utilized to facilitate infrastructure huge projects such as metros and airports. More recently, what we see is that there has been a growing trend to their disseminations of PPP to various sizes of municipalities in a process of enclosure almost everything that can be converted into revenue streams. In this process, everyday urban space, such as bus terminals, park, municipal markets, and even cemeteries have been privatized in Brazil, resulting in various urban and social impacts in the last years. In the terms of public policy agenda, we see that public policy agendas have recurrently been important to articulate these different business agendas. As a clear example of that, these articulations is the prominence of cities in the new industry policy announced early in this year. This policy was called the New Industry Brazil. In this policy, organized into 6 intersection missions inspired by the consultants of Mariana Mazzucato, the third mission focused on promoting sustainable infrastructure, sanitation, housing, and mobility for productive integration and well-being in cities. This mission prioritizing areas such as e-mobility, the battery production chain, digital and low carbon constructions, and metro and railway industry. While the interconnections between real estate and infrastructure agendas and their links with green and digital strategies are becoming increasingly significant, the research agenda needs to be more cohesive. So now I talk a bit about the challenge for academic agenda. In Brazil, we have substantially body of studies, as I mentioned before, on financializations focused on large developers, with recent expansion into the analysis of financial instruments, notably the real estate investment trusts. These studies have brought together research from various fields with notable participations from geographers, architects, urban planners, and economists, providing a foundational for multidisciplinary approach. I believe that advancing in the understanding of the connections between real estate production and infrastructure, as well the increasing incorporation of environment and digital strategies, seems to be the challenge for this already established multidisciplinary field. Analyzing the discursive dimensions of this process and the growing contradiction is essential. What we have been seeing is the immense difference between the reality and what we find in the reports of this company. So the labels and all the policies are really discursive, and in the practice they are they are not changing this unstable sustainability that I mentioned before.
Okay. Before I share some thoughts about the research agenda on the financialization of spaces based on the French context, I would first like to revisit the way in which this field, this research field, developed in the country. On the one hand, there are urban political economists like Natasha Avlin, economic and urban geographers, and urban planners that have delved into the burgeoning international field on this, this issue following the 2008 crisis. They have supervised master's and PhD theses, cultivated a small community of about 15 members working exclusively or intermittently on the issue of the financialization of the built environment. And they also contributed to the international debate in the field. And on the other hand, we have the French sociologists, particularly in the field of economic sociology, that have conducted or supervised many works where urban or rural issues are incidentally emerging, right? And due to their strong autonomy and self-determination as a dominant discipline, sociologists have not engaged with the first branch, that of the planners, urban political economists, and geographers. Fortunately, after 15 years of this dual dynamic, there is a change, thanks in particular to the collaboration between Eve Capello and Ludovic and Antoine, but also other younger researchers such as Antoine Ducastel or Eduardo Ferlazzo. So for me, the first frontier is to lies in this transdisciplinary discussion and developments, at least in France. Now, shifting to the political and economic context in France, my initial analysis suggested that the long-cherished asset class of financial investors was commercial properties, and it is now facing severe threat. Indeed, non-residential investments halved between 2022 and 2023. Vacancy was already high due to an oversupply of offices, but it is now reaching around 10% in the Paris city region, where institutional investors, financial investors, are the most present, obviously. So vacancy is now a question that this industry can no longer ignore, as they did before. And I believe that research on the strategies of asset management companies for maintaining the illusion of a market viability, but also for recycling distressed assets, for instance, transforming offices in housing, and for promoting new asset classes, opens up avenues for research in France. One of these new asset classes is housing. As I said before, housing was not an asset class considered by investors and asset managers, but the central states and these investors have intensified in the recent years their efforts to facilitate the penetration of finance into this sector. For example, insurance companies have purchased buildings or acquired stocks through bulk sales in the recent years, although such occurrences are still rare. Antoine will present on Friday the collaborative efforts of the state, public investment banks, and financial institutions to develop different asset classes in the housing sector. This is certainly an important avenue for research in France. However, given the knowledge accumulated in other countries on about the financialization of housing, I'm curious to explore whether there is really room for theoretical development here. In any case, the financialization of housing is also encountering resistance in France. As I said before, the financialization of housing, especially social housing, prompted mobilization. My point is that these controversies and conflicts surrounding the financialization of tangible assets represent a third avenue for research in France. And indeed, these controversies are not only for housing, but debates also emerged recently for two other cases, at least. The first one is the financialization of retirement homes, since a scandal erupted after the press linked the yields demanded by shareholders of retirement homes company to the poor treatment of elderly residents in some facilities. And a third area of controversies and conflict is agricultural land. It is a highly symbolic issue in France, agriculture and agricultural land, and thus its financialization is controversial. In this case, there is currently a bill which is discussed in the parliament, and this bill will facilitate the financialization of farmland properties. It is a bill supported by the right wing, but also the main union in the agricultural sector, which favor agribusiness. And this highlights the political constituencies of financialization. However, there are also peasant and environmental movements, as well as scientists and journalists that are highly mobilized on the broader issue of agricultural models. And these three cases, housing, retirement homes, and agricultural land, illustrate how the relatively silent financialization of spaces and urban and rural landscapes during the last 3 decades could now give rise to new and effervescent social movements, and thus also open research avenue in the near future about this social movement linked to the financialization of spaces.
Well, thank you very much. In this case, my intervention will be a bit shorter than the previous one. First of all, because financialization in Argentina, it's a topic that it has only been recently studied, and our academic system is also under attack, and therefore the resources, the time, and the people are being cut everywhere. So the topic is not so has not been studied that much in the past years, but there are some exceptions. As I said in my previous interventions, as a vulnerable economy, Argentina is very dependent on waves of foreign investments, and it's very vulnerable to international shocks. Financialization, therefore, as the way I see it and other economists see it, is organized around external debt and public instruments to support capital flight, which in turn is transferred to tax haven. So this has remained a hot topic among economists. Credit, debt, and other financial schemes are linked to how regulators shift subsidies between agribusiness, energy companies, mining companies, and in some cases, urban infrastructures. As I said, in the case of electricity or transport being having its prices highly regulated, and as I said, being very politicized issues and very key topics in the political agenda, they remain as a form of frontier of financialization. And as I said, financialization is done through the companies and not so much done through the households. So at this point, with this new government, I see another wave of strong pro-market neoliberal reforms to support and facilitate high yields in short-term extractive processes, such as another wave of privatization, deregulation, subsidies, etc. Because of the short term and that momentum is key to understand financialization in Argentina, it's hard to see foreign investments focusing on mortgage-based securities, but there is another wave of trying to securitize and promote long-term debt among households. but and they are actively showing and producing journal articles about that every day. But I see it hard to happen because foreign and institutional investors, as I said, are more interested in consumer credit, fintech, and other more liquid securities to invest in. So the debate has focused around these topics, and only sporadically have other researchers seen these processes happening on real estate, as I said, on some commercial real estate, and some liquidity in pesos, and they channel that to real estate. But this is, again, this was 2-3 years of high regulations. But what remains a very important topic is corporate financialization, foreignization of traditional conglomerates, and the agribusiness mediated by diversified family-controlled business groups. That remains a topic very much discussed in the country, and Bia and I will present something on that sort tomorrow. Yeah.
So I also have somewhat abbreviated comments on agenda. I do think that for American scholars, many of us have come of age in an era of zero interest rate policy. So the ZIRP urbanism, as I call it, the urbanism that has been shaped by very, very low cost of capital and the ability of advanced actors, investment banks, and certain institutional investors to directly capture that capital, that has shaped a lot of our world. Right, and that is certainly for me, who came of age in the subprime era, who studied subprime mortgages in the early years of my career, but even reaching back into the 1990s, a lot of our world has been shaped by that. And I don't know that the current moves to raise interest rates are really a fundamental break there, but they certainly are an interruption to a system that we've come to understand as one in the US context as a free flow of capital, the formation of new niche sectors, the ability of finance to innovate and to solve, or at least solve in its own terms, urban problems. So the post-ZIRP era, and what does that look like, and how do we understand it, I think is a fundamental challenge in some ways, right? It may require us to develop a new vocabulary, certainly to challenge some of our assumptions about the way that finance capital potentially behaves, and that could be at the project scale, right? Simply the ability of very low interest rates and the logic of leverage to produce profit where profit might not otherwise be possible. At the project scale, we're already seeing that play out in terms of projects that are abandoned, plans for entirely new developments that are laid to the wayside. In Chicago, for instance, entire sectors of the city have been transformed over the last 15 years in very, very rapid form at an enormous scale by relatively new actors, and that's really a ZIRP phenomenon, I think. So the notion that even if it's a temporary interruption, what does that interruption roll into, I think is an open question. And moving beyond the project scale to the level of the circuit, right? The sort of the niche circuit of capital that flows in particular styles or categories of investments. Whether that's fintech, I think it's similarly with those of us who have studied fintech or studied platform urbanism, Airbnbs, or transport, ride shares and other forms of alternative mobility, specific commercial real estate market segments. All those have had some coherence because of this kind of ZIRP era. And I think the challenge in many ways, right, for a lot of us following one of our primary methods is to sort of inhabit the standpoints of the actors that we're studying, right? Understand from a quarter by quarter basis the transformations in profit opportunities, in competitive strategies, right? We sort of, we put on our Macquarie hats or our McKinsey hats, and we sort of, right, become de facto real estate consultants trying to understand. And that gives us an insight into the dynamics of those investments, but at the same time, it sort of makes us captive to the standpoints of those investors. And so in a post-ZIRP era, how do we manage, I think from a, and I'll go to, I'll defer to Felix's, right? These are sort of disciplinary challenges, not just in the sense of what's going on out in the world, but how can we make sense of the coherence of a system, not just on a quarter-by-quarter basis in terms of new profit targets or the slightest manipulation on competitive strategies by the actors we're interested in, but how is the system itself changing, and what is the relation of those quarter-by-quarter dynamics to the broader forms of capitalist dynamics, whether they're profit-making or whether they are actually other, right? I think we haven't really talked about some of the social questions, the questions around social reproduction, for instance. I think that those are all wrapped up in this, in these questions. I will say, in terms of agenda, I'm here to learn from many of you. I think the 2022 gathering in Lyon, some of you I recognize from there, but I came away with the strongest sort of takeaway I had from that gathering was just the strength of a Brazilian standpoint. Right, historically attuned. Right, it was a style of political economy that was much more historical than I think than what we've come to see from, say, American or British or Belgian, Dutch scholars. Right, so it understands sort of the histories of capitalism. It's attuned to the changes in corporate form that have emerged over out of the colonial period into different kinds of state projects. So in many ways, I think the answer to the question of what is the agenda, I'm sort of hoping to learn as much from you as I can, to take inspiration from that Brazilian style. Yeah, then I think I'll leave it there.
So just 2 or 3 words about the challenges to come. First, I would like to come to your questions before about migrants, because Switzerland is a small country, but still it has a very strong population growth. It's 1% each year, which is quite a lot. Okay, and for a small country like that, it's an issue. It's an issue because on the one hand, the land which can be urbanized, it has become very restricted. Second, when people want to build towers, there are referendums and they are systematically rejected, so it's not possible. So the last issue consists in densifying cities. Okay, but as you know, this is a tough issue because people like the idea of densification. They don't like the densification in their yard. Okay, so this is the problem. So. But the pressure is very. This debate is very tough. Today, even ecologists have turned them into anti-migrant party, partly. But just to say that there are kinds of trade-offs today that are not easy. The solution which is supported up to now consists in shifting from, let's say, to build the city through very large projects. This is the idea, to densify the city through very large projects and to rebuild the city, okay? And these projects are very often very expensive. It's several billions of dollars, yes. And they are planned on 10, 15, sometimes 20 years, okay? And the interesting point is that, and this has been brought by big finance, because since we have big finance, the size of the projects also increased a lot, okay? Which means that there is some kind of planning intelligence which has developed at a totally different scale. And the idea today of these big developers consists in putting all the people, the relevant actors around the table to discuss and to find ways to build more efficient, more positive, let's say, a positively working city, taking into account all the dimensions and creating more value out of it, okay? So all the players, except, of course, financiers. And it's only when all is arranged, when the city has been rebuilt, when people are, for example, commercial centers function, when all of the housing has been rented, that these big developers go to the financier and say, okay, now you can invest, okay? So they're always in a second place position. But the consequence of this is that slowly there is an increase of living costs, not only of real estate, but also several other services like health services or others. And the interesting point is that, can you imagine that in Switzerland, 1/3 of the retirement pensions, 1/3 of the retirement pensions are paid abroad, which means that 1/3 of the people go abroad to have their retirement, which is a choice for some of them, of course. For example, foreign workers, they prefer to go back to their country of origin, some of them, but it's also an economic choice, very clearly. So it means that we have now a kind of crowding out at a national scale, which is quite an a process which, of course, has some political and consequences and induces some debates. Well, perhaps I'm going to stop now, and we have still time to open the discussion with the audience.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah? Thank you so much for a wonderful opening plenary. You covered so much ground. I think we can just go home now, don't you think? No? My question is about going back to the public buildings and green transition. Felix brought this up. I'm also asking this question from a personal perspective because I sit on the board of an organization, a nonprofit, that owns a lot of residential real estate, sort of an affordable housing organization. And for the last 5 years, we've been involved in building a net zero apartment building that is intended also to be affordable, and that those two things are often in tension with each other because the expense of investing in this green building has made the rents go up and up and up and up. So the argument for the public sector being kind of a model or kind of leading the way for the energy transition, using its own buildings, right? So public buildings have often been the first to be LEED certified in the United States, right? To reach new standards for green building. The argument was always that the green buildings, the public sector green buildings would, in effect, construct a new market, right? That we needed somebody to take on this initial risk, or we needed some part of the development community to, you know, be the first person on the dance floor. So the public sector was seen as sort of modeling behavior, showing the way, percolating new innovations, you know, and helping the private sector sort of move up the learning curve. But the more I think about it and the more I watch both this train wreck of a development project that my own organization is involved in, but also watching it in different contexts, and then now hearing about green development in other countries, I'm wondering whether or not the sort of public and private are two sort of separate market segments, one heavily subsidized and one not, and so that those innovations developed in the public sector are not going to, you know, spill over into the private sector. That's one option. Another option is that these, you know, having the public sector lead the way in green buildings is also another way to kind of open up the sector for new forms of capture, monetization, new methods of privatization, because it's often not the public sector itself that's building green, but they're hiring private consultants, contractors, developers to kind of do it for them. And then I'm also thinking that there may be something valuable in looking back at the literature in economic geography that many of us have kind of turned our backs on, but there may be a parallel here with technology transfer and kind of commercialization. Which initially was the idea that universities, for example, should be able to spin off, you know, new innovations and new ideas that led to a lot of federal investment in the United States in, you know, grants to help for, you know, these, you know, to commercialize technologies or in ideas or innovations from the university sector, and then it became just kind of a constant. You know, it sort of like was a permanent part of this world, the expectation that there's always going to be federal or, you know, public subsidy to do this kind of work, right? You thought, oh, well, we're going to just model behavior initially, and then the private sector will take this and run with it, and we can pull back on public support. But I wonder within the green building sector if some of these arguments aren't just a way to have, you know, public de-risking in perpetuity.
Thank you. This was really interesting. I just have a quick question on, like, some of you mentioned like pathways forward and resistance, and I'm interested if you could talk a little bit more about what resistance looks like across those different contexts at the moment in your perspective, or what are some of the possibilities for resisting some of these processes of urban financialization that you discussed. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot for all these very interesting presentations. I'm going to pick up the ball where you just left it, Isadora. And on the question on capitalism as usual that you mentioned in your question. The question is, you've been spending a lot of time, and we have all together, looking at maybe one specific financial infrastructure that is capital markets. And now that we are talking about, you know, we are looking across the board in those 5 different countries, do you see as alternative not only resistances, but also other financial infrastructures or financial circuits, whatever you want to name them, that offer opportunities to find other paths than pure capitalist accumulation?
First of all, thank you. First of all, thank you for the presentation. I was wondering also, like, the green transition pathway. I don't know, here in Brazil, I think like the pathway to transition right now is also not associated with the progress, like with progress and development of the country. Even right now, with progressist like governments, is kind of opposite to, I don't know, to development itself. But in the presentation, I think Europe thinks opposite of that, thinking like the green development as a necessity for the development itself. But I don't know, like in the question of Rachel, I think she puts like the private sector, like the public sector is guiding the private one. But here I think like with certifications and maybe like ESG and this kind of initiatives, the private sector is guiding through these certifications, and not like the opposite, not the public one is guiding and like giving the guidelines that, I don't know, I think it should be what is needs to be worked. Like the public gives the initiation and then the private one follows. But here with the certificates and ESG, that is not necessarily what we need right now, but it's what it's happening, and it's what I think like our pathway to transition and our pathway to a greener economy, it's happening right now. And I don't know if you think like if the development of a green economy, it can be worked together with, I don't know, right now with Lula, with, I don't know, a progressist governments. I don't know, because even with the progressists, I think we cannot have this discussion like enough, because it's still like seen as I don't know, it's an agenda for another time. I think our agenda in Brazil is like to try to industrialize the economy. It's a thing much like 2000s and the 90s, and we are back to this with this government. And I don't know what you think, but kind of this question. Thank you.
Yes.
Who would like to answer, make a comment?
So many interesting questions, just some thoughts. Come back to Phil. I think we have a very challenge for academia. I think we really need to go through the discussion, what's the social points for all this financialization. And in Brazil, I would add that besides the increase in living costs, I remember this yesterday, we discussed how this a lot of people living in the streets became a normal. And for me, an important discussion is how we integrate all this whole discussion about financialization with this reality, the ground reality that is common in many metropolises. And in Brazil, I think we have this challenge because we have so many people studying favelas, precarity on the other hand, and we are here discussing financialization, and we didn't, it's quite hard to connection the both phenomena. So in Brazil, besides this increase in terms of living costs, I think there is also a process of invisibilizations of a lot of costs that are mediated by the state. So we have a lot of subsidy, public funding that make viable many financial products. So to highlight this invisible process, I think it's quite important. And also it's really related with what Rachel mentioned about this public-private dynamic. I would say that here in Brazil, I saw the public as I believe that we have this agenda, this global agenda, this agenda that came from the central countries, that the market really gets. But on the other hand, what makes viable the insertion of this agenda is all the public support, even in terms of policies, but also in terms of a lot of kinds of subsidies. So it's a tough and it's quite important. And in terms of resistance, I think it's a very interesting topic. And what I have been seeing in my research is in the theme of infrastructure. And what we see in São Paulo right now, it's a strong increase in resistance in terms of public infrastructure, mainly the metro and railway systems. And what's interesting, we have a kind of join of the usuary, normal usuary of the system with the labor that are involved in this process. So we used to have a very strong union in the metro company, and now they are suffering for all this pressure to privatization. And privatizations mean the lack of any right in terms of labor. So we have seen a very interesting join, a very interesting articulations through some internet movements, but on the other hand, the process and this legitimacy of PPP is so hard that it's a kind of tough and also very different, powerful structure. Yeah, so it's more or less. But we can continue during this free day. I think will be amazing.
I can talk a little bit about Rachel, your question about public buildings and sort of the green financing of green transitions. There's really two models, I think, that I am aware of for the financing of a green transition involving public buildings. One is a sort of public service model, right, where the public sector absorbs the costs and the risks of the massive capital investment necessary to transition at least public facilities towards a greener energy footprint. And that's, I think, closer to the French system, right, where the sort of conduits to central banks funnel capital into the hands of localities to invest in retrofitting schools or pools or other public facilities. And alongside that, they invest in sort of the market-making activities, right? So if you follow the sort of French conversations over the last couple of years, a lot of it focuses on the availability of consultants to be able to do energy analyses, particularly in smaller cities and municipalities across the country. And that's a very sort of public model. The American model is not public at all. There's very little other than, say, local leadership, and Chicago is a good example, where Chicago committed through its local climate action plan 15 years ago to exercise leadership in transitioning its public facilities through retrofits. But the dynamics of austerity, and I didn't really talk about austerity because the American conversation about austerity is much more complex than just the dynamics of financial markets. The dynamics of austerity, Chicago doesn't want to borrow money because borrowing money triggers a reevaluation of its credit rating, and that hampers its ability to use borrowing to solve other problems. And that's one of the dynamics of austerity in the US is local states essentially turn to financial markets to capital markets as ways of releasing pressure, right, of managing cash flow difficulties, of investing in economic development projects that potentially grow the local tax base. So borrowing directly to pay for the cost of investment in their facilities, in retrofitting facilities, jeopardizes that entire package. So instead they turn to these innovative, sort of essentially a PPP model. And it's not surprising that Chicago, in particular, one of the sort of paragons of the public-private partnership model in infrastructure in the U.S., led the way in developing sort of innovative ways of trying to recruit private investment to do the hard work of investing in green building technologies. When you look at those models on the up close and personal, they're train wrecks. So they involve essentially the green rent that I was talking about earlier, at least two different ways, right? So on the one hand, the city itself doesn't necessarily have the capabilities to do the analysis of energy flows and to lock in those energy changes through technological investments. So it turns to private actors, particularly energy service companies or ESCOs, who are sort of hybrids of engineering companies that know the engineering side of it, and financial firms that take a risk. They speculate on energy savings in return for a fee. And my math, and I've been able to get into the weeds with some of these deals, my math is that fee is somewhere around, say, 12% of the total energy savings are just grabbed as a profit margin for an ESCO for taking on the risk of generating energy services. That then is also magnified by the cost of borrowing. So if you're borrowing private funds to pay for those upfront capital costs, that's an additional interest rate. The interest rates themselves are often not that high, but you are often spending a year or more investing, right, in the cost in the process of construction. So essentially, the building itself is not generating any energy savings. So much of the savings essentially are kind of wrapped up into a nice little ball and handed off to financial partners. And alongside that, all of the things that we would expect from a financial partnership are brought to the table. So, for instance, long-term paybacks, right? Energy investments that take a long time to pay back or that have high upfront costs are essentially kicked out of the process, right? The things that we need the most in order to generate the energy footprints we need for a green transition are kicked out of the process because they don't have a valuation profile that matches the sort of the dynamics of a contemporary deal. there's lots of ways, I think, and I can go on and on about the Chicago example, but lots of ways I think that where we see the transition as essentially a kind of even if the partners come to it with an earnest desire to invest in transition, the results are not what we need.
Yes, just 2 words about Rachel and Ludovic's question, remarks. I think it's very interesting today because can all environmental issues be solved by this kind of capitalist governance? And obviously not. Obviously not, because there are issues that have to be dealt, let's say, for the benefit of the earth, and not for the benefits of some people or some companies or that. Okay. But how can we do then? Because now we are in an institutional setting which obliges the public hand to get indebted in order to make something. And to be indebted, of course, means to develop once again a capitalist accumulation circle. Okay. So a very interesting example, in my opinion, to think about these issues is what happened under the COVID time. Because during the COVID time, what did public states did? They got indebted in order to cover, let's say, to give money to a part of the population that could no longer produce. Okay, and the result today is that the younger generation has to pay a debt which does not bring any advantage for it. Okay. A debt can be justified if you, I don't know, you build a bridge, and this will be for the next generation also. So it's normal that they get something to pay for that. But if you have the COVID, we just spend money that has absolutely no impact on today's economy, today's infrastructures, and young people have to pay for that debt. So here, what we would have needed is a fundamental change in the monetary creation institutions. I mean, we should have created the money needed for the COVID crisis by the central bank. Okay? It would have helped a lot, and young people today would not be under the constraints of paying debts that have nonsense for them. And it's the same for some of the issues of the ecological transition. For example, to rebuild the humus layer, okay? This is something that will not bring anything to let's say, it's really for nature. And this, in order to finance this, we should absolutely find again ways to create money through certain governance schemes, of course, but to build new ways of developing a monetary policy which would help in these directions.
Okay, I will try to respond to Rachel's question, but also to the question of Isadora and Ludovic. So, Rachel, yes, there is this idea in France of the exemplarity of public authorities when in the refurbishment and transformation of their own properties. This was very focused on new structures, new building during the 90s and 2000, inclusively for the ecological models. The exemplarity for the renovation of existing structure is quite recent. But it appears in the discourse of the local elected officials or local managers. This is not only an issue of exemplarity, and it was one of your points. There is, in some occurrences, the idea that they create a new, what we call filière in France, a new expertise, that they support some new companies that are acting in the field of energy production or energy savings. We have, for instance, a case in a very little city that we study in a research project with Ludovic, which is called Cahors, in the southwest of France, and they really tried to build a new group of craftsmen that were able to use some ecological materials, and these craftsmen were linked to a local production of eco materials, but they failed. I mean, they built this building, they trained the people, but then the private market, the local private market, did not employ this expertise and these people. This exemplarity and this effort are facing a problem that of public finance, how to finance these works. And in the recent years, there has been many new products by public and private banks that are financing local authorities. But I don't know how much they are used. But yes, there is now this offer of specific credit loans for the renovation, eco-renovation, and energy saving in savings in public buildings. Now coming to the Isadora and Ludovic remarks and question, as I said before, in my opinion, the financialization of some kind of assets in France, and especially commercial properties, was not really resisted. I mean, there was not a strong opposition in that way. I think that it's when assets are very symbolic, like housing, like retirement homes, like agricultural land, as I said before, that there is a terrain for opposition. There is more groups that will coalesce for opposition. So, what is our role as a researcher in these dynamics? I think that there are three possibilities that are not contradictory. The first one is to defend some models. As I said, for instance, in France, we have our pay-as-you-go system, and there was a political project to end with this system and to open pension funds with all the consequences for the financialization of the built and unbuilt environment, as we commented before. There is also the model of the social housing in France. So it's important to document, I think, these models and to show how much they are performative, how much they are important, and the results that they produce. I mean, the social housing in France is an important share of the housing, especially in cities. It's 25% in the main cities of France. So I think that it's important to show how much it's effective. The other possibility is to analyze, to document alternatives, and there are many research, for example, on the community land trust. So it's also important to, I think it's an important aspect. And there is a third possibility, that of thinking about alternatives. Not only document, analyze, but thinking about this. It's very challenging. I think that at my level I'm not able to do this, but I will take a recent example. It's a book by Cédric Durand and Razmik Keshayan, which Cédric Durand is a quite famous political economist. Razmik Keshayan is a sociologist of ecology. And they recently published a book which propose a planning for the ecological bifurcation. with left-wing, let's say, lenses. And for instance, and I think that there are two levels. The first one is about the words, the concept. For instance, they say that we cannot speak about ecological transition, but we must speak about ecological bifurcation. So there is a war on the concept with the policies and the business fairs. And there is also in their book a very concrete proposal to how to do and how to finance this transition. So they inclusively pretend to invent some circuit of financing of this transition. So yeah, this is a third path, a third way to think about our work, our role in these debates, I think.
I'll be very short because about green buildings and public buildings, I would say it's not at all on the agenda these days. And as in the case of Brazil, from what I understood, what's happening is that the private sector is pressuring the government sector to increase subsidies in order to construct these green buildings, but are targeted to very elites and I mean high income buildings and high commercial property for multinational companies, and those are the only buildings being produced under this logic. The way in which the as I said, the green transition is only thought at the production of emissions level and not so much at the consumption level. The way the public sector reduces consumption is just simply by selling public buildings and selling land, the old way of reducing costs. So I would say it revolves around that. On the case of resistances and alternatives, because our financial system has been always so weak to think long term, there are many institutions coming from social organizations and grassroots organizations in charge of providing funding for the long term to the people. So I would say that if we are innovative in any way, is in financing housing and long-term activities outside the financial system and outside financialized schemes. So I would say that there are, like, cooperative banks are very strong in Argentina, and the people participating in the cooperatives really have a role in the way decisions are made. Of course, they are not outside the economy. They are not outside of capitalism, but in many ways they are very much alternative ways of dealing with for-profit activities and and economic activities in the long term, and they have different rationalities and different logics, and they work in a very different way. So they are, of course, underfunded with problems, etc., and they have the problem of inflation, of course, but there are still many alternative financial ways to fund social housing in general and other economic activities outside the traditional financial system. So.
Okay, thank you very much. We are probably at the end of our session. So thank you very much to all the participants and to the audience.